The image of the fallen angels has become deeply familiar in the imagination of many generations. These beings, once radiant, created to serve God, were cast down because they could not resist the beauty of earthly women. They were condemned as those blinded by lust, blamed as the origin of a giant race, the Nephilim, and held accountable for bringing about the Great Flood. But what if everything we know is just a thin layer of paint over a much deeper and darker truth? While the Book of Genesis dedicates only a few lines to mention the sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, the Book of Jubilees, along with Enoch, opens up an entirely different picture, a picture that does not begin with flesh, but with spirit, not sparked by sexual desire, but by something far more subtle, divine pride. According to the Book of Jubilees, the angels, also called the Watchers, were sent to earth not to marry or to learn to live like humans. They were sent to maintain order among humanity, which was spiraling into corruption. They brought with them light from heaven, divine power, and wisdom that mankind was not yet ready to receive. But then, they began to see themselves as different, superior, revered, called masters, gods, and bearers of knowledge. Their desire didn't stop at the physical, it extended into a longing for stolen glory. They wanted admiration, they craved influence, they sought power, and when human adoration touched their hearts, the light they carried began to distort. From guardians, they became manipulators. From servants of God, they became counterfeit deities. In the Book of Enoch, this fall is marked by a dark covenant on the summit of Mount Hermon. 200 watchers took an irrevocable oath that if one were judged, all would share the same fate. They didn't merely sin, they sinned deliberately. With organization, they fully understood the consequences, but chose to proceed together, to seize a power that only God Himself deserves. This is the part that has long been hidden. It wasn't a fall driven by carnal lust, but by the desire to be worshipped. A quiet yet razor-sharp rebellion. I am worthy too. And in that whisper, there is something eerily familiar to the story of Lucifer, the first light who chose to exalt himself above the Most High. And if this is true, then the story of the fallen angels isn't just about the heavenly realm. It is a warning for those who carry the light, yet begin to believe they are the light. A tragedy not confined to the past, but one that continues among humankind for generations. The story of the fallen angels has been told as a tragedy of lust. They, powerful beings, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, could not resist physical attraction, and broke divine law to take them as wives. And so began their fall. Simple, easy to grasp, easy to accept. But upon deeper reading, especially through texts like Jubilees, Enoch, and a host of ancient Jewish writings, we see the truth is not that simple. It's more complex and far more frightening. The story has been simplified into a moral lesson on lust, but Jubilees paints a different picture. The Watchers didn't just see physical beauty, they saw an opportunity to manipulate, to control, and to be worshipped. The women they chose were not merely objects of desire, they were instruments for implanting into humanity a new breed, A hybrid generation, the Nephilim beings no longer of heaven and no longer human. It was an ideological hybridization, not merely a carnal fall. The Book of Enoch goes into greater detail before the fall. The angels gathered on Mount Hermon and formed a covenant. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it was forbidden. They knew they would be judged, but they still went forward together. This was not a moral accident. It was a calculated conspiracy, with a clear motive to alter the divine order. Why then was the story reduced to they fell in love with women? Perhaps because the truth is too hard to accept, that the first rebellion did not stem from lust, but from a hunger for power. From the moment created light began to crave being the center. From angels, those who carried heavenly light, choosing to make themselves teachers, gods, givers of knowledge and power, and that is an act of treason. Not everyone is ready to accept that angels can betray not for flesh, but for personal glory, that a fall can begin not from a wandering glance, but from a heart once lit, that ignites itself out of ambition. When the truth is oversimplified, we feel more comfortable, but we lose our vigilance. We see lust, but miss the scheme. We condemn the act, but fail to discern the motive. But if we don't understand the root of the first fall, how can we recognize it when it repeats in another form? In our world today, one of the most controversial phrases in the entire Bible is the sons of God, found in Genesis chapter 6, according to modern tradition. Especially since the time of Church Father Augustine, many believe the term refers to the righteous lineage of Seth, Adam's third son, while the daughters of men refer to the corrupt line of Cain. This union was seen as a moral intermixing, leading to downfall. But if we return to the older interpretation shared by pre-Christian Jewish authors, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and especially the Books of Jubilees and Enoch, the picture changes completely. In the original understanding, the sons of God were not human, they were angels. More specifically, they were watchers, divine beings, sent by God to watch over humanity, but who ended up betraying their mission. Jubilees and Enoch do not shy away from this. They explicitly refer to the sons of God as watcher angels, and recount their deliberate fall upon seeing the daughters of men were beautiful. They not only lusted, but formed a covenant to take them as wives, producing a hybrid race, the Nephilim. These beings were not the result of a mistake, but the product of a willful disruption of divine order. The Seth and Cain lineage explanation only emerged in the 3rd century AD, as an effort to soften the supernatural and controversial nature of the passage. But before that, from Jewish sages to early Christians, no one doubted that sons of God referred to heavenly beings. Evidence lies in the Book of Job, where sons of God is also used to refer to angels who stood before God's throne, including Satan. Denying the angelic nature of the term grammatically, contextually, and historically is really an attempt to humanize the supernatural, making the story more palatable to modern reasoning. But the truth still stands. Preserved in Jubilees, the first traitors were not descendants of a family line, but beings who once lived in the light, yet chose the darkness. The common image of fallen angels is often wrapped in a tale of misguided love, radiant beings drawn to the beauty of earthly women. who stumble in a moment of weakness. But Jubilees, together with Enoch, reveals a much different truth. The fall wasn't accidental. It was organized, calculated, and carried with it an agenda far graver than a physical impulse. According to Enoch, 200 angels, the watchers, gathered at Mount Hermon. There, they not only vowed to take human women as wives, but also bound themselves with an unbreakable oath, a kind of anti-covenant in defiance of God's order. They knew full well what they were doing was a violation, but they were willing to bear the consequences together, so long as none of them was left alone. But what made them dangerous was not lust, it was divine ambition. After joining with humans, the Watchers did not only produce the Nephilim, a powerful hybrid race, but also revealed sacred knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess: how to forge metal into weapons, how to use roots and enchantments, the art of seduction and cosmetics, astronomy, and celestial calendars, secrets that belong to heaven, now handed to unworthy hands. They didn't just love, they taught, manipulated, dominated. From those sent to protect mankind, they made themselves false gods, standing in place of God to distribute light. But the light they gave did not come with wisdom. It was fragmented knowledge more capable of destruction than healing. This is what made their act not just a moral transgression, but an attempt to replace God's role in human history. They sought to become the source of knowledge. They wanted worship, wanted to be called the fathers of civilization. And when humans began to praise them, call upon them, follow their ways, the heavenly light had been so distorted, it became unrecognizable. Therefore, the fall of the Watchers was not simply about loving the wrong kind of women. It was a subtle rebellion where love was just a cover for a spiritual power grab. And if we still think this only happened in the past, perhaps we have not looked closely at the forces educating the world today. Under the banner of enlightenment, while most Bible readers focus on the outward act, the union of angels with earthly women, the books of Jubilees and Enoch invite us to look deeper into the very moment of the first fall, which didn't occur on earth, but in the unseen realm where light and thought intersect. Before the Watchers fell in body, they had already faltered in mind, a silent descent that echoed into heaven. The second heaven, according to Jewish tradition, is not where God dwells, nor is it the earthly realm. It is the intermediate space, where angels guard order, observe, intervene, and protect mankind from chaos. But it was there, in that place, that a quiet rebellion began, not with swords, but with ideas. The Watchers, originally sent to serve, began comparing themselves to the Creator. They saw they had power, light, and knowledge. They began to ask, why can't we teach mankind what we know? Why is this knowledge withheld? Why can't we become givers of light? And that question was not wrong until it became intent, when comparison turns into ambition, and ambition becomes collective consensus. An irreversible rebellion has begun. They no longer saw themselves as keepers of the light, but as those worthy to stand in the midst of the light. No longer loyal servants, but beings who believed they deserved to sit as equals. They forgot they were created to reflect glory, not to shine by themselves. This explains why the judgment upon them was so severe, because God did not merely see their outward actions, he saw the inner spiritual root, a storm of pride, quietly swirling from the second heaven, sweeping down to the earth and dragging generations into disorder. The Watchers did not just sin in time, they disturbed the eternal order. And from this, we understand sin does not begin only with wrong action, but with unholy thoughts. The fall is not always loud. Often, it begins in silence, in the moment we stop being guardians of the light and start wanting to keep the light for ourselves. After Adam and Eve's fall, the world no longer functioned according to its original order. Sin entered and fractured the relationship between humanity and God, between humans themselves, and even with creation. According to the Book of Jubilees, God in his mercy did not abandon the world to chaos. He sent angels to earth, not to judge, but to preserve order and guide humanity back to divine light and wisdom. These angels, called the Watchers, were appointed as guardians, observers, and protectors. They were endowed with superior understanding, heavenly wisdom, and power to restrain the spread of darkness. At first, they were faithful to their mission, but then a shift began, not by command, but from within their own hearts. Some Watchers began to grow discontent with their role as mere observers. They saw how weak, fragile, and easily influenced humanity was. They started intervening, first subtly, then intentionally. They didn't just guide, they began teaching. They didn't merely protect, they controlled. And slowly, they covertly altered their mission. Instead of leading humanity back to God, they led people to themselves. They became divine instructors, givers of knowledge, of power, of tools, but not of holiness. Jubilees does not describe this shift with thunder, but with a gentle slide, almost unnoticed, an abuse of influence, a blurring between service and control, a thirst for praise instead of quiet obedience to God. And when the Watchers veered from their mission, no one warned them, because they were the most trusted. And that is how rebellion began. What's terrifying is they did not rebel with a declaration of war. They rebelled by redefining service, a little manipulation, a little pride, a little selective interpretation of God's word. And so, darkness began to wear the disguise of light. And the question for us is, how many rebels today are still called guardians? How many lights have been bent right from the places we assume to be most holy? No one expected the collapse of divine order to begin with. Cosmetics and swords. But that is exactly what the books of Enoch and Jubilees record. The Watchers, those angels sent to safeguard the world, brought knowledge from heaven and gave it to humans. Knowledge they were never meant to possess. Not holiness, not wisdom, but secrets of metalwork, weaponry, sorcery, and the art of beauty. One of the Watchers, named Azazel, taught humanity how to craft swords, shields, and armor, ushering in an age of bloodshed. Before this, humanity lived in harmony with nature, unaware of the lust for war and conquest. But when iron and steel were forged by hands that did not value life, war became the first tool of power. Another Watcher, Semjaza, taught the making of charms and spells, The use of roots, creating forms of invisible control. Mystical arts, not meant for the spiritually immature, now passed around like toys among children, and it did not stop there. They taught women how to adorn themselves, how to paint their eyes, dye their hair, wear jewelry to enhance their allure, seemingly harmless things, but in reality, masks designed to hide true essence, to build a society driven by illusion where appearance overrides identity, and external form is valued more than inner virtue. Jubilees implies the problem wasn't knowledge, it was the timing and intention behind its transmission. Like handing fire to a child who doesn't know the difference between warmth and destruction, humanity at that time was not morally ready. They needed to be guided step by step to discern good from danger. But the Watchers skipped the process, fast-forwarded not out of love for mankind, but because they wanted to be seen as the source of light. Knowledge, originally a gift from heaven, became poison in immature souls, and the result, human society fell into chaos, not only because of weapons and wars, but because of moral disorientation. They were given power, but lacked the wisdom to wield it rightly. They knew much, but lived wrongly. And that was when heaven began to withdraw its light. Because when knowledge is severed from holiness, it ceases to be light. It becomes darkness in angelic disguise. At first glance, the fall of the Watchers appears to stem from lust. They saw the daughters of men and were drawn to their beauty. But a deeper reading of Jubilees and Enoch reveals that lust was only the visible tip. Behind it was a far greater hunger, the desire to be worshipped. When the angels were sent to maintain order on earth, they came bearing light, power, and knowledge far beyond human grasp. Initially, they fulfilled their mission with loyalty, but then they saw themselves admired, saw humanity trembling before them, saw eyes of desire, gratitude, and reverence, as if they were gods. And that awakened something never meant to exist in an angel's heart: pride. Instead of leading people back to the Creator, they began to hold them for themselves. They liked being called Master, Guide, Guardian Spirit. They received prayers, accepted offerings, and dispensed knowledge as if they were the source of light. The role of mediator was forgotten, and they gradually claimed a place that belongs to God alone. The danger is, humanity did not resist. They gladly offered glory to those who gave them knowledge, power, and influence. Human greed met angelic pride, and distortion began. The line between truth and falsehood blurred, between light from heaven and light reflected from arrogance. Enoch describes the situation with a phrase that cuts deep: ambition hidden in light. The Watchers didn't appear as villains. They appeared as enlighteners, as spiritual guides. But it was precisely this subtlety that made them dangerous and made their fall a lasting wound in the story of salvation. And in that spiral, both angels and humans were deformed. Humanity placed its hope in the wrong place. Angels declared themselves as gods, and at that point, God intervened not only to judge, but to save the very concept of truth that was being distorted. When angels forget, they are servants. When humans forget, they are creatures. Then the gap between heaven and earth begins to crack. In the Book of Enoch, a sacred text at Qumran and among pre-Christian Jewish communities, there is a strange, dark, and dramatic scene. 200 watcher angels gather on a mountain named Hermon, not to worship, but to form a covenant, not to swear loyalty to God, but to swear collective rebellion. Mount Hermon, in the north of Canaan, was considered the boundary between heaven and earth in ancient Semitic thought. But in Enoch, it becomes the site of a deformed sacred ritual. There, the Watchers, led by Semjaza, who is described as the leader trembling at the known consequences, make a blood oath. They swear if one of them is punished for the coming plan, all will share the same fate. They were not ignorant. They were not deceived. They acted intentionally, strategically, with organization. That covenant was not protection. It was a contract of rebellion, the first step in a plan to challenge cosmic order. By binding themselves together, they formed a divine alliance, a counter-covenant in opposition to the covenant between God and humanity. In the Bible, all sacred things begin with covenant between God and Noah, between God and Abraham, between God and Moses on Sinai. Covenant is the foundation of relationship, communion, and faithfulness. But here, on Hermon, there is another covenant, a dark reflection of every glorious promise, a vow not to preserve life, but to protect control, to legitimize the usurpation of divine authority, to walk together into ruin. Enoch records with horror from that very place. The Watchers began executing their plan, taking human wives, birthing Nephilim, teaching forbidden knowledge, and sowing chaos on earth. The mountain that should have been closest to heaven became the starting point of total corruption, not underground, not in shadow, but on the highest peak. Light was betrayed, and from there, a principle echoes throughout salvation history. All things that rise against God begin with a replacement covenant. No swords needed, just beings with power and light convincing each other that they are worthy. Many stop at the detail that the angels fell for human women and view that as the primary reason for their downfall. But if we see only surface-level desire, we miss the core of this tragedy. Lust was not the root, it was only the symptom, a smokescreen hiding a smoldering fire, the rejection of divine order, and the attempt to replace the Creator with counterfeit light. In Enoch, before the Watchers took wives, they made a covenant. Before they taught forbidden knowledge, they swore to act together regardless of consequences. This shows that lust was not the beginning, but the final step in a deliberate chain of rebellion. They did not stumble in sudden temptation. They planned to invert roles from messengers to masters, from guardians to sources of illumination. They passed on to humanity forbidden knowledge, yet without imparting wisdom, without anchoring it in holiness. They taught mankind how to extract resources, but not how to honor life. They opened the gates of knowledge, but shut the doors of morality. And so, humanity learned how to craft weapons before learning how to live in peace. They learned how to seduce before learning how to love. They learned how to possess without ever learning how to give. This was not light from God. It was a distorted light. Light severed from its source. Light carrying the shadow of pride and the hunger for power. And the Watchers, instead of leading mankind back to God, drew humanity toward themselves to be worshipped, to have their names praised, to stand at the center. Both Jubilees and Enoch reveal a bitter reality when knowledge is detached from its sacred source. It does not elevate, it drives humanity into chaos. And when angels begin to desire worship, they cease to be angels. They become adversaries of God, even if they still wear the appearance of light. Therefore, this story doesn't end in lust. It is not merely a lesson about physical desire. It is a warning about a fallen mind when knowledge is used to take God's place, and light is used to blur the truth. In Genesis 6, the Nephilim are mentioned in just one short verse. When the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. There were giants on the earth in those days, a strange, vague detail, almost forgotten amid the longer narrative of Scripture. But in texts like Enoch and Jubilees, the appearance of the Nephilim is the collision point of two realms and the living evidence of the devastating consequences of rebellion. The Nephilim were not merely giants in stature, they were the outcome of a counter-covenant, where the Watchers, rather than guarding divine order, took human wives and birthed a generation that was half heaven, half earth. It was a union not permitted, a fusion between the sacred and the base instincts of flesh. Each Nephilim was a distortion of creation, where light was no longer pure and instinct no longer restrained. According to Enoch, the Nephilim were not only massive in form, but brutal, greedy, and morally unbounded. They devoured everything: humans, animals, land, and flesh. They ruled by sheer force, sowed terror, and brought the world to the brink of annihilation. In ancient literature, they are portrayed as mighty kings, undefeatable warriors, but heartless, soulless, severed from the divine. They were not born of love. They were born of pride and corrupted power. Each Nephilim born was a scar that showed the cosmos was breaking where angels crossed limits, and humans became too large to be led. They were the clearest consequence of the sacred being dragged down to serve human greed, and light being used to shine on personal glory. The presence of the Nephilim is not merely a mythic chapter in human history. They are living symbols of the rupture between heaven and earth, a warning that certain boundaries, once broken, cannot be restored by reason or human strength. They didn't just damage the physical order, they tore through the moral and theological fabric of all creation, and so their existence demanded a heavenly act, the Great Flood. Not simply to wash away the Nephilim, but to cut off the rebellious bloodline, to seal shut the gate between two realms that had just been pierced. In the world's view, knowledge is always good. Learning, discovery, advancement are seen as humanity's glorious progress. But Jubilees and Enoch tell a different story, a story of angels who brought knowledge from heaven, but instead of leading mankind closer to God, they opened the way to chaos. Not because knowledge is evil, but because it was given to the wrong people, at the wrong time, and no longer tethered to holiness. The Watchers brought secrets never meant to be known: metalwork, weapons, potions, spells, cosmetic adornment, star reading, and mystical symbols. All of this, if guided by wisdom, could have been tools to serve God. But when handed to those who lacked reverence, who couldn't tell sacred from profane, this knowledge became a double-edged blade, cutting man off from his divine origin. The terrifying part is the Watchers didn't just corrupt humanity, they lost themselves. With every piece of knowledge they passed down, they stepped further from what they were created to be: messengers and servants of God. They no longer submitted. They became alternate sources of light. And when knowledge is no longer for obedience, but for control, for impression, for worship, that very light becomes darkness. Enoch describes the rise of this fallen magic as a black wave spreading across the earth. Not just war, but spiritual deformation. A new idolatry, humanity worshipping knowledge, power, the ability to manipulate reality without God. That magic, though it began in heaven, was stripped of its holiness, leaving only manipulation, untempered by morality. Jubilees does not condemn knowledge, but it clearly shows knowledge without obedience breeds monsters. And monsters don't always wear horns and claws. Often, they come as philosophers, inventors, enlighteners, but with souls that have lost all sense of what is sacred, what is right. And this is the timeless lesson when understanding is divorced from faith. Science goes astray. When power is detached from service, magic becomes a prison. When angels forget they are carriers of light, and begin to believe they are the light that is the beginning of the fall, the rebellion of the Watchers could not remain hidden forever. When the earth was filled with violence, when their hybrid children, the Nephilim, destroyed life with greedy hands and hollow hearts, when humanity was dragged beyond every moral boundary, God spoke, and in Enoch, that voice was not thunder, but a divine sentence delivered through the angels. 2 angels were sent to execute judgment, Uriel and Raphael, not strangers, but ancient, faithful servants, unfallen. They did not come with swords, but with command, and the sentence was recorded, terrifyingly clear. The Watchers, those who swore the oath at Mount Hermon, would be bound, buried deep within the earth, in a pit of darkness where light does not reach, until the day of final judgment. This was not punishment of flesh, for the Watchers were not human. It was the removal of presence, the severance from God's light, the imprisonment in a realm of darkness where glory is forgotten and memory finds no forgiveness. They were silenced, no longer permitted to teach, no longer allowed to walk among mankind. They became sealed beings, awaiting the day when all justice would be fulfilled. Enoch, under God's command, became the mediator. He was sent to hear the petitions of the Watchers and to return with the verdict. But when they pleaded for mercy, when they wept in the depths, when they wrote their cries in celestial ink, the word from God was no. There would be no return, no undoing the dark covenant, no reconciliation for those who knowingly rebelled. This is one of the darkest chapters in all ancient apocalyptic literature, not because God is cruel, but because justice cannot be purchased with late tears. Those who once gave knowledge without wisdom, who declared themselves gods, cannot return to their original place as if nothing happened. And through this story, Enoch reveals not only the fate of the Watchers, but a divine principle light that turns against its source will never shine again. And prayer, if not grounded in truth and surrender, is but an echo falling into the abyss. In ancient texts like Enoch and Jubilees, the Great Flood was not merely an act of cleansing the earth. It was a cosmic purge, aimed at a threat unlike any other in creation's history, the existence of the Nephilim beings, half angel, half human. They did not belong to heaven, nor to mankind. They were the result of a counter-covenant, a species with no home to call their own. When the floodwaters came, the Nephilim's massive, brutal, untamable bodies were swept away. But the problem did not end there. Their souls did not vanish and could not return to where the Watchers once dwelled. Because they were hybrids between heaven and earth, their spirits were not admitted into heaven, nor cast into the abyss with their angelic parents. They were trapped, and from that entrapment came demons. According to Enoch, these spirits became restless beings, wandering the earth without rest, constantly seeking entry into the world of the living. They are creatures ever hungry, ever angry, ever craving materiality, emotion, and power, but lacking bodies to fulfill those cravings. And so they seek to possess human bodies, giving rise to demonic possession, hauntings, and dark spiritual forces known across religious traditions. Jubilees confirms this with chilling clarity. These spirits exist even to this day. And Asael, one of the Watchers who was bound, is the source of many of the post-flood demonic forces, no longer able to control the world with physical power. They now target human will, emotion, and soul. They no longer tear flesh, but shred identity. They no longer destroy temples, but destroy trust and inner peace. What's most frightening is humanity often doesn't realize it's engaging with a legacy of the Nephilim. When people open the door to occult practices, to fallen knowledge, to spiritual allegiances not rooted in God, they may be inviting these restless spirits into their lives. And that is the ultimate consequence of the counter-covenant, when the rupture between heaven and earth produces a race that belongs to neither. Not even death can extinguish them. They simply change form and continue, whispering in the dark. When Eden closed, humanity began its journey in darkness, but they did not walk alone. They carried with them the memory of the light and the wound of the fall. Instead of submitting to God for guidance back, they learned to guide themselves. And in the space between God and man, the Watchers entered, bringing counterfeit light, distorted knowledge, and a new model of rebellion after the Nephilim were destroyed by the Great Flood. Many believed that dark chapter had closed, but the truth is, the seed of rebellion did not die. It only changed shape, and it returned in full force through a figure present in both scripture and extra-biblical tradition: Nimrod, the founder of Babel, Assyria, and the first cities of post-flood humanity. Jubilees and many ancient texts suggest that Nimrod inherited the spirit of the Watchers, He had no angelic body, but he carried the same thirst for control, domination, and mastery over human destiny. When he built Babel, it was not to honor God. He and his generation declared, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens, to make a name for ourselves." Genesis 11:4. This was a dangerous repeat of Eden and Hermon once again. Humanity chose to rise above their appointed place, rejecting divine guidance, constructing an eternal structure, not with a blood oath this time, but with bricks and mortar. Fallen angels were no longer necessary. Humans now rebelled on their own. Babel was not just a construction project. It was a symbol of self-centered ambition, of civilizations that no longer placed God at the center. And from Babel, we see the blueprint of later empires: Egypt, Babylon, Rome, each built upon a dangerous blend of unholy knowledge and unrestrained power. The watchers may have been bound, but their spirit, the hunger to be gods, to be the light, to decide destinies, entered the flow of human history. And through Nimrod, rebellion ceased to be a singular event. It became a system, an inverted order, where man is enthroned and God is pushed to the margins. From Eden to Babel is a spiral from the first fall to an organized defiance. And unless we recognize this cycle, humanity may be repeating the past with modern appearances. But ancient hearts, in the Gospels, there is a prophecy from Jesus that is often quoted, but rarely explored in its full depth. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24:37. For many, this evokes an image of a sinful, indifferent world, living in pleasure and unprepared for judgment. But when Scripture is read through the lens of Enoch, Jubilees, and the ancient texts, this prophecy becomes far more sobering. The days of Noah were not just days of human depravity. They were the days of the Watcher's rebellion, the rule of the Nephilim, the detachment of knowledge from holiness, and the use of power to dominate rather than to serve. If that is the model for the end times, then perhaps Jesus was pointing to this. The spirit of the Watchers never died. It still lives, still operates under new forms, with new language, using new tools, but it is the same ancient counter-covenant. Today, rebellion no longer comes from fallen angels. It comes from the systems humanity has built in technology, in politics, even in religion. As human knowledge expands at breakneck speed, morality struggles to catch up. As power is cloaked in the language of peace, it is used for control and manipulation. As religion ceases to be a place of worship and becomes a tool for ego, reputation, and influence, the Watchers have returned, needing no old forms. And what is more frightening, many do not even realize it. Because today's Watchers do not teach metalwork, they write algorithms to manipulate public psychology. They don't cast spells, they invent technologies that reshape belief, control perception. They don't demand worship, they silently claim God's place in collective consciousness, where prayer is replaced by the pursuit of quick solutions. When Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah," he wasn't merely warning against apathy, he was pointing to a cycle of rebellion. rising once again with modern tools. But ancient nature, a time when false light will be mistaken for truth. A time when the counter-covenant won't be made on Mount Hermon, but inside systems that no longer place God at their center. And in that age, the awakened will not ask, "Is this reasonable?" They will ask, "Where does this light come from? And does it draw me closer to God, or pull me further away?" When we read about the watchers in Enoch or Jubilees, we often think of an ancient story of fallen angels, divine rebellions, knowledge given at the wrong time. But then, looking at today's world, one question echoes: have the watchers truly vanished? Or rather, are there modern watchers not in angelic form, not descending from the clouds, yet quietly teaching mankind in ways that subtly distance them from God today? Knowledge is exploding. Never has humanity known so much. Under labels like science, progress, liberation, innovation, millions of data points are exchanged every day. But amidst this ocean of knowledge, how many stop to ask, what is the origin of this light? Where does it come from? Where does it lead? Does all knowledge carry wisdom? Does every insight make us more humble before the Creator, like the ancient watchers? Many systems today are instructing but not guiding people toward God. They grant power without demanding spiritual accountability. They teach how to control the world, but not how to bow before the sacred. They call humanity to discover, to conquer, to dominate, but they no longer speak of limits, of surrender, or of faith. And thus, this knowledge, though useful, becomes false light. There are new watchers who do not sit on Mount Hermon, but reside in labs, textbooks, screens, economic models, and even in distorted religious pulpits. They don't need a blood oath. Modern society's approval is a strong enough covenant. They don't need to cast spells only to refine algorithms, shape information flow, and control belief through data. Jubilees once warned when knowledge is separated from holiness. It is no longer light. It becomes a silent weapon of disorientation. And today, we must ask ourselves a simple yet vital question. What am I learning from whom? For what purpose? Because the modern watchers don't need to wear white robes. They only need to make you forget who God is and believe that knowledge is enough to replace revelation. The story of the watchers ends in the abyss, bound, sealed, stripped of light with no chance to return. They knew, yet chose rebellion. They bore light, but used it to dominate. And so, the gate to restoration remained closed for them. But humanity is different. Each of us, though we've erred, walked astray, or been seduced by false light, is still invited to return. Unlike the watchers, man was not created to hold power, but to live in relationship with God. When we forget this, we begin to rebel like them, seeking control instead of obedience, desiring the center instead of worship, wanting to understand everything instead of trusting. But the beautiful truth is, God never closes the path back. The heart of God always waits, not for an all-powerful angel, but for a humble human. Each time we choose humility over pride, prayer over calculation, forgiveness over vengeance, listening over manipulation. Light from heaven shines again into the shadows, the very shadows where the Watchers first distorted the order. And it is at that same point of rebellion that healing can begin. Jubilees shows though the angels were sealed, humanity continued to be led. God did not abandon mankind. He gave the law, gave the prophets, gave the covenant, and ultimately gave his only Son. He does not demand that we understand all, know all, or control all. He asks for one thing, a heart that returns. The path to restoration does not lie in strength or knowledge. It lies in the awareness that we are not God, in the courage to abandon the false light we once embraced, and return to the true light, quiet, humble, and often unnoticed. That is the journey that reverses the logic of the Watchers, not rising to dominate, but lowering ourselves to be lifted up. And when man chooses that path, the path against ambition, then a new Eden can begin to open, not in the sky, not beneath the earth, but in the heart that bows low. Many read the story of the Watchers as ancient myth, a religious memory left in the past. They see in it strange angels, giants, blood covenants, and restless spirits, and close the book as if it belongs to another world. But the books of Jubilees and Enoch do not merely recount the past. They hold up a spiritual mirror so we might see ourselves, this age, and the choices we silently make every day. The fall of the angels did not begin with violence, but with what seemed a harmless choice to pursue knowledge without holiness, to claim power without mercy, to lead without submitting to God. That path is still open to us, not on Mount Hermon, but in our work decisions, our educational values, our diluted beliefs, and in how we live our interior lives. Each time we speak the truth just to be praised, do good to maintain control, or seek truth without listening to God, we are retracing their footsteps. And that mirror does not reflect the face of some ancient angel, but our own eyes, looking out at today's world. Jubilees wasn't written to tell a strange tale. It was written to warn of a cycle of fall that is repeating now in subtler forms. False light disguised as knowledge, false greatness masked as service, spiritual control hiding under the name of freedom. This story is not behind us. It unfolds in the mind, in the systems, in sermons no longer grounded in God's word, in modern lives that have pushed aside the sacred to glorify human capability. But it is precisely when we recognize this that we can step out of the mirror. Not by denying knowledge, but by placing it under the guidance of the Holy One, not by rejecting power, but by using it to protect, not to dominate, not by erasing history, but by rereading it as an invitation to live differently. Because if angels once fell by forgetting their role, then humanity is saved by remembering who we are and who God truly is. Could it be that you are also standing at an invisible Mount Hermon, not the place where angels once swore rebellion, but the very intersection within your heart where a quiet decision is shaping the direction of your soul? No one sees, no one knows, but you know, and God knows. Perhaps the story you've just heard of the Watchers, of the Nephilim, of the counter-covenant and fallen light is not just an ancient page of history. Perhaps it is repeating itself, not in the second heaven, but in the deep layers of the modern human will. Each day, we are invited to choose, where does this light come from? What is this knowledge for? Where will the power we hold lead us to service or domination, obedience or control? You don't need to stand on a high stage, wield a sword, or swear a blood covenant to choose hollow glory when you place yourself at the center, when you prioritize effectiveness over truth, when you seek applause over the whisper of God. When you act as if you are the one who determines what is right, instead of listening to the one who is the source of all truth. But even in that place, that inner Hermon, a different path can open, the path of humility, the path of restoration, the path of souls who choose to bow rather than to rise, who choose the true light, the kind that doesn't dazzle the eyes, but quietly illuminates from within. You don't have to be an angel to fall, and you don't have to be a saint to be lifted up. You only need to look back, to breathe, to hear again the voice from the beginning where God didn't thunder, but whispered in the cool of the day. Where are you? And if today you hear that voice, don't run, don't hide behind knowledge, behind achievements, behind empty religious labels. Stop, return, choose the light, not the counterfeit light of praise, but the light that comes from presence. Not the blinding light that makes others look at you, but the gentle light that guides you back to God. The story of the Watchers ends in the abyss, but your story does not. And how it ends is not written by anyone else. It is written by you, each day, each choice, on the sacred mountain within your own heart. Amen.